Sometime around 2004, Transformers fans all around the world got the bestest news ever possible. DreamWorks and Hasbro officially announced that a Transformers live-action film was in development, with Steven Spielberg attached as executive producer. This was huge news. I mean, Steven frickin' Spielberg. Indiana Jones, E.T., Jurassic Park, Jaws. I mean, with him at the proverbial wheel, there was no way anything could go wrong with our precious robots in disguise, right? Right? Now, before we get started, I'd like to point out that this is the third part of my mini-series about the Decepticon leader Megatron. If you haven't seen the first part, wherein I cover Megatron's different origin stories, or part 2, where I talk about the different Megatron toys, I've got the links of both of them in the description below, so please do check them out. Take note though that both parts are all about G1 Megatron, not the live-action one, which is what I will cover in this episode. So with that out of the way, let's go back in time to the year 2004. The year when Transformers fans all around the world went absolutely nuts, with the official announcement of the very first ever live-action Transformers movie being officially greenlit. And from that point on, all the way up to its actual release in 2007, the interwebs were afire with news and speculation as to how the movie would eventually end up. Every bit of information, interview quotes, official or leaked concept art, and production pictures were thoroughly discussed and analyzed by Transformers fans everywhere. Of course, I would think that the two greatest concerns of the fandom were basically which Transformers would actually be in the movie and what they would look like. I mean, there were the two obvious ones, the iconic leaders of the Autobot and Decepticon factions, Optimus Prime and Megatron, who had very distinct looks. Granted, we all had to collectively accept the jarring general aesthetic shift from smooth, blocky robots into sharp and at times convoluted alienish beings. For the most part, at least when it came to the Autobot leader, Prime's general look did pay a reasonable enough homage to the OG design. A bit bluer and flamier than usual, but still recognizable as Prime. Megatron, on the other hand, was another story. So we have this really early concept dated 2005, which was probably during a point where they were still experimenting on the overall look and still leaning towards the cartoons for inspiration. While nothing spectacular, there was no mistaking this as none other than Megatron. But a year later, this little picture surfaced of a huge spiky thing that, due to its predominantly gray color, was heavily theorized to be Megatron. And we didn't have to wait very long, a few months actually, to find our theories confirmed, with even more clearer concept art released. Yeah, let's just say not everybody was thrilled about this. The actual timeline is a bit fuzzy, but I do believe that by this time, we had seen a good number of concepts released. Some pretty cool, like this unfamiliar character Blackout, and some like Starscream looking like a cross between a gorilla and a Dorito. But either way, for better or for worse, we had already accepted the fact that we would not be getting the same bots that we grew up watching on TV. That being said, Megatron was a much harder pill to swallow. Yes, he looked pretty fearsome and he was gray, and that's about all that he had in common with the Megatron that we knew. I mean, twisted metallic spiky details aside, there was nothing that gave off any Transformers, hell, robotic vibes. This design looked almost organic. And yet, all of this could have been saved had the designers included just one iconic detail that would have easily identified him as Megatron: his enormous fusion cannon that he wielded on his right arm. But yeah, even that wasn't there. Anyway, the first Transformers movie finally arrived, and well, despite all our fears and worries, it was quite the epic event. It was far from perfect, of course, but I think it's safe to say that for the most part, a decisive majority of Transformers fans, including myself, loved it. For all its faults, the first Transformers live-action movie was a major financial success, and more importantly, turned those robots in disguise into household names. And as for Megatron, he didn't do too bad for himself as well. even if he was pretty much barely in the movie, but that was okay. Now, I know that if you're watching this video, you've most likely seen the 2007 movie, but again, for the sake of those who haven't, the movie tells the story of an alien race from the planet Cybertron who come to Earth in search for the movie MacGuffin called the AllSpark, an ancient artifact that is the source of life for all Cybertronians. Anyway, while not told in the movie per se, this Megatron's backstory was told in the pages of the supplementary comics by IDW. As that story goes, millions of years ago, Megatron was brothers in arms with Optimus Prime, both serving under the leadership of Sentinel Prime. Unfortunately, this arrangement ultimately didn't sit well with Megatron, as it became obvious over time that Sentinel favored Optimus and viewed him as his eventual successor. Gee, I would think that the shared name Prime would tip him off. In the end, Megatron came to resent Prime, which led him into forming the Decepticons and waging war on the Primes. Anyway, amidst this great war, Optimus Prime felt it best to blast the AllSpark into space to keep it away from Megatron. But Megatron gives chase to the AllSpark on his own and ends up being lost in space as well, which leads us right into the first live-action movie set in the present day. Well, 2007. So it turns out that the AllSpark crashed onto the planet Earth, and Megatron, literally hot on its trail, lands in the North Pole, where his body, extremely heated up from planet entry, melts the ice beneath his feet, submerging the Decepticon in freezing waters below, placing him offline. Anyway, millions of years later, both the AllSpark and the frozen Megatron are eventually discovered and recovered by the American government agency Sector 7, which is where they remain for the majority of the movie. Of course, aside from hunting down the AllSpark, the Decepticons arrive on Earth in order to find their lost leader as well, which they eventually do. In the final act of the movie, a frozen Megatron is thawed out, revived, and begins to wreak havoc on the humans and Autobots alike. And just to give credit where credit is due, I do believe that the writers did a good job in building up the threat of Megatron throughout the movie. And when he finally did arrive, he did not disappoint. Within his first few minutes of action, he manages to berate Starscream, classic Megatron, rip the fan-favorite Autobot Jazz in half, instantly killing him, and shoots down Prime with his fusion cannon? Okay, so I could be wrong, but I do believe that this Megatron's version of a fusion cannon was sort of a last-minute addition to appease the fans. I don't know. It just felt forced and looked pretty lame. With him clapping both hands together to form a cannon out of nowhere, you'd think he set off a sonic boom or something. But in any case, the point was that this Megatron, voiced by the actor Hugo Weaving, really felt like a true menace, a transformer that all other Transformers feared. A boogeyman type of character whose revival and return genuinely terrified the Autobots. Until, that is, he met his embarrassing end at the hands of the human Sam Witwicky, who overloads Megatron with the power of the AllSpark. Yeah, that kinda sucked. And what sucked even more was that Megatron's fate was spoiled for me as I was in line to enter the theater, as some a-hole who was on his second watch just blurted it out in front of everyone. Fucker. Anyway, despite being dead and dropped into the deepest underwater trench on Earth at the end of the first movie, it wasn't a big surprise to see Megatron revived at the beginning of the second movie, The Revenge of the Fallen. But honestly, if you ask me, I think it would have been better off that he stayed dead. Almost immediately after his resurrection, the writers pretty much castrate his character by making him subservient to the new baddie of the film, the Fallen. I don't know, it was such an abrupt switch, with one scene where he claims while choking Starscream that there is no command but his, to the very next one where he literally bows down to his master. It pretty much ruined his character. Now, to be fair, he did manage to kill Optimus Prime during an epic forest fight in the middle of the movie, but when Prime was eventually resurrected, Megatron was basically no match and was easily defeated. And in the end, basically ran away with his proverbial tail between his legs to fight another day. And just like his master's namesake, this Megatron had fallen far from the frightening dude that we were introduced to in the first movie and into the decrepit and literally rotting loser we find in the next movie, Dark of the Moon. The third live-action movie finds Megatron living a sad life of isolation in the middle of the African plains of Namibia, being kept company by a skeleton crew of Decepticon operatives, namely Starscream, Soundwave, Laserbeak, and some little dude named Igor. Anyway, when the new baddie of the movie was revealed to be the recently revived, spoiler, Sentinel Prime, Megatron joins forces with the old ex-Autobot in his grand plan to activate a space bridge to bring Cybertron to Earth. In the end, in true bad guy fashion, Megatron betrayed Sentinel Prime as he was this close to killing Optimus Prime, basically saving him. And in gratitude, Prime, well, jams his battle axe into Megatron's head and rips it from his body, spine included, and pretty much ends him. Until Megatron is rebuilt and reborn for the fourth movie as dun 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 Galvatron. But the less said about this transformium-fueled transformer, the better. Just kidding. I've got a whole episode on Galvatron next week, so stay tuned for that one. And finally, we have the last version of the live-action movie Megatron in The Last Night, wherein Megatron, that's right, Megatron, because apparently somewhere between the fourth and fifth movie, Galvatron hooked up with a new master, the Cybertronian goddess Quintessa, who, aside from restoring him back to Megatron with a new knightly body, tasks him with retrieving her stolen staff, which she needs to drain the life force of Earth in order to restore the ruined Cybertron. At first glance, aside from the fact that he submits once again to do the bidding of another master, this seems like a return to form for Megs. I mean, he definitely looks a lot better and cooler until you realize that character-wise, he's pretty much become a caricature of his former self. I mean, Megatron from the first movie annoyingly flicked away humans as they ran away from him. And now here he was comically negotiating with them to release more of his Decepticons who were in custody. Really? The OG movie Megs would have just taken his men by force. Who knows? Maybe the humans were holding his beloved Igor hostage or something. In any case, he does assemble his crew, who are introduced in an out-of-nowhere montage ripped straight out of the Suicide Squad movie. Mohawk, Dreadbot, Nitro Zeus, Onslaught. I mean, you'd think that given such an intro that these guys would go down as some of the biggest and baddest Decepticons ever. But no, they're basically just mostly killed off in the next action scene by the Autobots led by Grimlock. And Megatron? Well, he fails once again and gets his ass whooped by Prime. Like, he's literally kicked in the chest through a wall and is never seen again. Nothing memorable at all. And that was it. One last thing worth mentioning about this guy was that the voice of the original G1 Megatron, the legendary Frank Welker, returned to give life to this version of Megs. Actually, he also voiced Galvatron in the previous movie as well. So, yeah, looking at this version of Megatron's full character arc, there really isn't much to see but the progressive destruction of what should be one of the most iconic Transformers of all time. After what I consider to be a pretty strong, fairly adequate debut, it was pretty much downhill from there, and will most likely be recognized in history as one of the worst portrayals of Megatron's character ever. But it's not all bad. In fact, I would say that this Megatron has at least one significant redeeming factor, and that would be his ever-evolving designs, and, well, as a result, his toys. To a certain degree, that is. And unlike his character arc, which got progressively worse from movie to movie, I would argue that his designs actually got significantly better with every new movie. So with that being said, let's go over them, shall we? But not before I go over my obligatory plea for you to help me make my channel grow and help me make more stories. You know the drill. Comment, like, subscribe, and share. All easily done with a single click. Except the first one, that is. You gotta type that one out. Regardless, though, of whichever way you choose to help me out, I will forever be grateful for the support. So, thank you. And now back to our story. First up, 2007 movie Megatron. Clearly, this is the weakest live-action Megatron in terms of appearance, as what we saw in the concept art was pretty much what we got on screen. Seeing this Megs come to life on the movie screen only made him look slightly better in my opinion. Bot mode was still blah, evoking nothing that I would call a transformer, but to be fair, he did transform into a three-pronged alien jet with bat-like wings ending in wingtips that pointed straight down. I mean, it wasn't terrible, just weird. And Hasbro designers definitely had their work cut out for them translating this design into plastic form. I mean, given the limitations at the time, I believe that the leader class Megatron that we got was just okay. He was big, as was par for the course for leader class toys at the time. But as was also the case, he was chock full of gimmicks like a sound chip, auto-morphing, and additional pop-up translucent spiky thingies. Oh, and he was also a little bit more colorful than the Megatron that we saw in the movie, with a few more bluish hues and the aforementioned pop-up spikes that were translucent pink. I'm guessing that the designers threw in all these gimmicks in order to distract us from the fact that this Megatron was far from accurate to what we saw in the movie, as they weren't able to completely hide away the majority of his alt mode wings in robot mode. Honestly though, I thought that his partially exposed wings made him look more imposing, but what do I know? The real fail for this guy was his alien ship alt mode, which looked extremely forced. A mess really, that is best left at that. Revenge of the Fallen saw Megatron ditch his alien jet mode and replace it with an alien tank, which apparently still had the ability to fly, so good for him. But for me, what mattered more was his robot mode, which was definitely more bulky and imposing, except for his left arm, which was more skeletal and scrawny in appearance, reminding me of that SNL character played by Kristen Wiig, I forget her name, who had really tiny hands. But overall, I didn't mind the asymmetrical look, as I felt it gave Megatron a little more personality, and of course, put more emphasis on his right arm, which was super jacked up, and finally wielded a formidable fusion cannon / bladed weapon. And Megatron's alien dual-toed feet from the first movie were also replaced by a pair of really oversized tank treads, which I imagine made walking a whole lot easier. But more importantly, I think it made him look cool and more menacing. The leader class toy that was released wasn't that bad either. Still not completely screen accurate, but good enough in my opinion. And for the longest time served the role as the default Megatron for my Transformers movie collection. By the third movie, Megatron finally settled down with a more earthy looking alt mode, now transforming into a massive, imposing, but still spiky fuel truck. And despite looking a lot more disheveled, I would argue that this Megatron was even more polished than his predecessor, replacing that previous monstrous hunchback frame with one that was more humanoid. I mean, the guy even sported some clothes in the form of a ratty old tarp that covered his fuel container in truck mode, and formed a cloak / poncho in robot mode, complete with a hood that kinda concealed his half blown off head, which was infested by little robot repair drones. Or whatever, robot bugs. I have to confess though that by this time I had pretty much lost interest in Transformers movie toys, and so never got a toy version of this Megatron, as well as the next version of Galvatron from the fourth movie, which saw him converting into a much more modern and sleeker truck cab, but whose toy was basically a glorified shell former. Easy pass. And finally, while arguably the worst version of Megatron in terms of character, I believe that the fifth movie, The Last Knight, gave us the best looking Megatron design of them all. I mean, yes, you could argue that he still kinda didn't look anything like what Megatron should look like, but for what it was, I thought he looked pretty cool, with his overall darker hue evoking the trope of a villainous Black Knight wearing an ominous-looking battle mask with a glaring red streak across one side, which could open up to reveal a menacing sharp-toothed demonic face. To be honest, his tusked head design did look strangely similar to a certain artificial intelligence turned evil robot hell-bent on wiping out mankind, introduced a couple years earlier in a film about avenging. But that's beside the point. This Megs also came with his signature fusion cannon, which admittedly looked a little smaller than usual, but he made up for it with his more knightly weaponry and equipment comprised of an imposing shield and a huge long sword, which was modeled after the African Konda sword or Ikakalaka. I guess Megs picked up more than we thought, blessing the rains down in Africa. And as for his alt mode, He was also back to transforming into an alien-looking spaceship, but this time around, it was a sleeker, more cohesive-looking aircraft. But before we go any further, I think it's worth mentioning that by this time, Hasbro did step up its movie Transformers toy game by basically rebooting everything with a new and more accurate Studio Series line where we got much more improved, albeit smaller versions of all the different Megatrons from the first 3 movies. I'm not sure if they did a last night one though. Please let me know in the comments below. But ultimately, as nice as all these Megatrons were, I honestly didn't care because by this time I had completely sold off all my retail Transformer movie toys and had since moved on to the larger, more accurate movie masterpiece toys, with a collection of mostly knocked off but arguably improved Hasbro releases and third-party ones as well. And while I originally set off to just complete the 2007 movie lineup, topped off with a very much improved movie masterpiece Megatron from the first movie, okay, fine, you got me. This is the knockoff and way better version of that release. Anyway, in 2020, third-party company Unique Toys caused me to seriously reconsider my hard line on that plan when they gave us their version of the Last Night Megatron called Dragoon. Now I know I say this a lot, but this was definitely an engineering accomplishment as Dragoon was a highly detailed and articulated, kibble-free robot that transformed into a streamlined jet with 0 visible robot parts. I mean, seriously, I am not exaggerating when I say that at first glance, you wouldn't think that this robot actually transformed into a jet, and vice versa, that the jet was actually capable of transforming into a robot. It's that good. And of course, to accomplish this toy sorcery, you would think that it would entail some extremely headache-inducing transformation, but surprisingly, it doesn't. I mean, I won't go flipping this guy between modes all the time, but for what it is, it's far from a nightmare transformation. Anyway, despite all these praises, I did not end up getting Dragoon, but instead opted for the 4th-party version. That's right, a knockoff version of this third-party bot. Released a year later, it was an impulse buy really, something to soothe the sting of seeing my beloved Lakers, the defending 2020 NBA champs, lose their bid to repeat and unfortunately go down to the Phoenix Suns in 6 games. I mean, they should have easily won that series and possibly the championship had Anthony Davis not gotten injured in Game 4, but sorry, I'm going off tangent here. So yeah, I opted for the knockoff version of Dragoon for 2 main reasons. First, that it was slightly improved from the original one in terms of quality and deco, but more importantly, he was bigger. So yeah, a real no-brainer for me. And while usually after the initial dopamine rush of getting a new toy eventually fades, I am left with an empty pit of regret over such an unplanned purchase, this guy has remained one of my favorites in my collection to this day. In fact, it led me to get more members of his crew to keep him company. And speaking of Megatron's crew, there was one member that I didn't mention earlier who was actually more established than the rest, and that would be our old pal, Barricade, who was last seen getting his ass whooped by Bumblebee and piecing out during a highway chase in the very first live-action movie. Yup, this familiar Decepticon makes a surprise return in an improved and more polished form as Megatron's new number 2 in The Last Night, and then proceeds to get his ass whooped again. But hey, at least he didn't die. Anyway, if you want to know more about this bad cop who loves to punish and enslave, I've got his story here. Or if you want other Transformers stories, you can check out this playlist over here. Either way, thanks for watching, and I hope you come back for more.